Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Wa sallallahu wa sallama ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Because we are starting with Guy Otten's questions and David Milne. So first, I think Guy will have the first opportunity. Asrar.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, pass over a microphone.
Thank you very much. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Guy Otten. I'm chairman of the Humanists. I'm also a humanist celebrant. I do non-religious humanist funerals, weddings, and namings. I was brought up as a Catholic, and therefore I'm very familiar with the first cause and the contingency arguments for the existence of God, because I was brought up in that tradition.
All Thomas Aquinas type of
stuff, which of course very much was influenced by Islamic thinkers before him.
adapted from Ghazali and others.
Absolutely. Very important, flow of ideas that went between the two religions, I think. So I was born up in that, and indeed I continue to believe in that tradition for quite a few years into my adulthood. I've only been an atheist for the last 20 odd years. In my maturity, I have been a lawyer and a tribunal judge in my day, and I'm now retired. I'm not interested in point scoring or debating particularly, because a lot of what's very interesting is to explain each other's points of view and try and understand by way of moving the debate.
Rationalizing and reasoning.
Okay, so thank you for inviting me to do this. There are dozens of interesting questions I would actually like to raise, and I've distributed some copies. And of course, as humanists are atheists by and large, as well as being humanists, so we're not particularly interested in the detail of Islamic theology and Sharia, obviously, because for us the fundamental question of the existence of God comes first, as it would rationally and logically in any event. So, although I'm quite interested in, particularly in the origin of Islam, if you want to have a discussion about that, I'd be very interested in doing that. Also in other aspects of Islam, I'm particularly interested also in discussing reasons why we think God doesn't exist, as opposed to just examining the proofs that God does exist, which is what I think we're doing today. So I have distributed a sheet which gives you an introduction to what atheism and humanism actually is, and I propose to leave it at that rather than go over that in some detail. Very happy to answer any questions about atheism and humanism if anyone wants to raise that at some other point, or perhaps in another discussion. Because if I read all that out, it would take about 10 minutes probably to do it.
You can read it out if you want.
Well, I'm very happy to read that. Would you like me to do that?
But what we can do is we can discuss page at a time, me and you.
Okay.
I think that would work out better. So the first page.
All right. First page, atheism. So I'm going to divide into atheism first and then humanism, because humanism is atheism plus something else. So atheism, to start with, simply means that we are not convinced by the proofs of God's existence advanced by people who believe in God, by theists. Now, I accept that there are some atheists who go further than not believing or not being convinced by the argument for God's existence. They argue that God doesn't actually exist, which is a much more positive statement. That's a different debate, an interesting debate I'm very happy to do, but that's not what we're doing today. As I understand it, it's simply talking about the arguments for, one area of the arguments for God's existence, namely the contingency first cause arguments. Now, most thinking atheists, in my experience, are convinced atheists. That is to say, they were brought up in either a religious tradition or in no particular tradition, and then have worked through the arguments for or against God's existence and have come to the conclusion they're not convinced by those arguments and have therefore become atheists. There are a few, and my partner is one, who were actually brought up as atheists, but they are relatively fewer in my experience.
Is that the first page? Can I?
Now, in every other area, other than the question of God's existence, it's necessary to ask atheists what they actually believe. I do note that it's often the case when just talking with people of religion that they tell me what they think I believe. And I think there is a mistake there, because atheists only essentially say they don't believe in God. Everything else is up for grabs. And there are even people who don't believe in God who don't believe in evolution. You know, that does happen. But most atheists do believe in evolution, for instance. And you know, most atheists are humanists, but there are plenty atheists who are not. For instance, there are Stoics, and there are, for instance, Buddhists even don't have God, and they're not humanists. So there are various different types of people who don't believe in God, but not all humanists. So that's the first page. Do you want to comment on that?
How would you make a distinction between agnosticism and an agnostic and an atheist?
Yes, thank you for that. Yeah. Now, agnosticism is about knowledge, I think. Gnostic means
From the word gnostic, yeah.
And so someone who's agnostic is someone who's saying they don't know whether God exists or not. An atheist, on the other hand, is about belief, which is a different test.
When you say belief, do you define belief in the same way as you would define belief for a religious believer, meaning a believer in God, or an atheist believer? When the word belief is applied to an atheist, would it denote something totally different? You make a distinction between the two, or would you say they are the same?
Perhaps I should just carry on to say what an atheist is in terms of belief. An atheist is a person who doesn't believe in God. That is to say, an atheist is not convinced.
So it's a negation of belief.
It's a negation of belief in God.
Yes.
Atheists may have lots of other beliefs. I mean, I believe that when I get into an aeroplane, I'm likely to get to the other side, safely. That's a belief, but it's not a belief based on faith. It's a belief based on experience and some understanding of the science of air travel and the reliance on experts who have made the plane. So that's a different category of belief to a belief in an unseen an unseen deity.
So an experience would lead to something which would give you certainty or near certainty regarding a human experience. That's something you would ascribe to, as opposed to some philosophers who don't acknowledge even human experience as imparting real knowledge. You would say that human experience is something that would impart knowledge.
Yes, I think from what I've seen of your videos and your previous talks, I think you and I probably agree that one of the sources of knowledge is experience and experimentation and what one perceives by senses. Are we agreed?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. Of course, belief in God doesn't fall into that category because no one has seen God, no one has experienced or heard God. We think. You may disagree with that statement. And therefore, God is a different category of something to believe in. It's not something you can believe in based on the sort of things that we find in our observable world.
We'll go on to that later with your development. But here, just to be certain, an atheist is someone who is totally convinced of the non-existence of God.
No. There are different types of atheists. The basic type of atheist is just someone who's not convinced of God's existence because they're not convinced.
While an agnostic is?
An agnostic is someone who doesn't know So most atheists are actually also agnostics as well.
This is what I meant at the beginning.
But we tend not to use the word
So, just to be clear to the audience as well, just to be clear, when we refute atheists, when I refute atheists, we refute atheists who are certain regarding their atheism, as opposed to agnostics.
Okay. So I'm not standing here as a positive, definite, there is no God person. I'm not saying that. I am very interested in the arguments that suggest that there actually isn't a God, but I don't think there's any proof of that. I think it's
a probability. I think
the existence of God is a remote
probability.
It's a possibility. I don't exclude it.
So you would not be classified as a fundamentalist atheist, like, let's say, Richard Dawkins, who believes...
I'm fully aligned with Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is not a fundamentalist atheist. He says there is a possibility that a God exists. Do you know the Dawkins scale of 1 to 7?
Yes.
Yeah, he himself is on 6. In other words, he says that there is a possibility that...
But the behavior of Dawkins would suggest he's more like a religious fundamentalist. So when a religious person is 7 out of 7 in believing in God...
Well, I think he's a forthright promoter of his point of view. And when you're forthright and you come up against people who find it quite sensitive to have their beliefs questioned, that's, I think, why
he does tend to find untrained religious people, meaning it's like finding an untrained atheist and debunking him. He does tend to do that.
Because he has debated a range of people, including, sort of philosophers and people like that. So I know what you mean, because when he did that television program in the States, do you remember that? He did a television program, he went around the States, and he did come across some really hardline fundamentalist Christians who were completely balmy. But then, from an atheist point of view, most religions appear a bit weird.
If religious people make up 98% of humanity, most of humanity would be bizarre to some extent. And atheists make just a small proportion of the world's population, or forthright atheists, I would say, as opposed to closet atheists. So because of that, people can be very selective.
I agree with 98%, but I don't have the stats. I mean, I have seen some stats which suggest that there are very large...
So here, just to move on a bit, agnosticism and atheism, again, the distinction...
Right. The atheism that I'm promoting is simply not being convinced by the proofs offered that a God exists. So
and just to be clear on this, for the audience as well.
And should I say that the burden of proof being on those who...
The Strattonician approach. In the Strattonician approach. But here, just to be clear on this, Muslim apologetics or Muslim theologians do not present proof for God which entails that the opponent or the disputant must necessarily be convinced. That eventually is a choice of the individual. The point of Islamic theology, or mainstream Islamic theology, is just to answer objections. At the end, the choice is of the person who is at the listening end. It's not something that we believe may convince everyone.
Yeah, I accept that. I mean, I think the same goes for any kind of belief. At the end of the day, if you believe, if you are convinced intellectually, then you're going to adopt that belief. Although I understood that in Islam there is a tradition that says that actually it's down to Allah whether He decides you're going to accept it or not.
To explain that regarding free will, what that entails is that every human being is born with free will. With that free will, if a person chooses to believe, then God will guide him. If he chooses to disbelieve, then he will be increased in his misguidance. But the choice, and just to be additionally clear, that when we say someone is obliged to believe, this is only regarding adults who have sanity, intellect, and the message of Islam reaches them clearly, as opposed to someone living in the Amazon jungle or a child, unlike Catholic theology, which says that if a child is not baptized, he could enter hellfire. In Islam, all children go to paradise because their minds have not developed. So, and the same with people born with mental illnesses or people born with any inability to comprehend the message of Islam. So that's just to be clear regarding salvation and other questions.
So, page 2?
Yeah, page 2.
Page 2 is about humanism. No, sorry, it carries on. One more sentence. You can carry straight on to humanism. So, humanists are essentially atheists or agnostics, or both. But there's something else about being a humanist over and above not accepting God. And in fact, the way that most people get to humanism is having decided that they're not convinced that a God exists. What then do they believe? What philosophy do they adopt for their lives? And that's where humanism comes in, because it is a philosophy or a life stance that says, A, there isn't a God, so what do we believe? We believe that there are humans around, and humans have to make their own minds up about how we're going to live, what purpose and meaning we're going to give our lives, what morals we're going to have, and how we approach the big questions in life, and how we're going to decide what we think. And so starting at that end, by and large, rationalism, evidence, and the scientific method, we think, are the most reliable ways of finding out about the world around us and making decisions about the world and about how we live. When it comes to morality, we see that morality is actually something that we've had ever since we evolved as human beings, some 60,000, 100,000, 200,000 years ago when Homo sapiens evolved. And even before that, if you look at groups of animals, they have rules about how they behave towards each other. So deep in our evolutionary past, as animals living together, before we even evolved to become Homo
So here, would you say, when you say morals are decided by community or human groups, would you say that would depend on a consensus of human society? So if there's
well, it should do, ideally.
if there's a community or a tribe that believes in cannibalism, according to humanist philosophy, would that be acceptable?
Well, what I've got to say there is that humanists generally believe in individual rights and human rights. So that's part of our understanding of what humanism is. So the mere fact that some communities believe in all sorts of...
But if they eat, after someone dies, if someone, after having died from a natural death, in a will or a testament states that my body can be consumed of my own volition after death, and the community agrees to eat dead human meat, would that be acceptable according to humanist philosophy?
I suppose it probably would, but I can't ever see it happening. I mean, I certainly have given my...
It does happen in some tribes. It does happen in some African tribes where they have cannibalism as an accepted norm.
It's not something I would be comfortable with, but the point is that there are a range of behaviours that humans come up with, and as long as they are behaviours that the community agree contribute to human welfare and the happiness and promotion of that group.
So if, again, an additional question to that would be, if incest is accepted by a certain community, would incest be acceptable?
Well, incest has in fact been practiced in the past.
Oh yes, of course.
In some ancient communities, and maybe even others. And again, you know, the test for us...
But would that validate? Yes, brother, sister, mother, and brother, and any type of whatever you define as incest. More specifically, what is illegal in most countries, which is brother and sister, and mother and son, or father and daughter. Pardon? Depending again, according to humanist philosophy, how would they define this? Because we would say, we as theists or Muslims specifically would say God is the one who defines morality for us. So that we're very clear on that. But
I'm just asking because in certain religious communities it is
not racial communities, non-racial, because in
there is a point here that is that it's actually not good in terms of
genetically speaking.
for closely related parents.
But if they use forms of contraception, meaning the genetical harms are removed.
Well, then the question then has to rely on whether that's good for society, whether that kind of relationship between closely related individuals is healthy from a social and domestic point of view.
But how would a humanist society, if they have a disagreement, form a consensus on what is deemed as moral and ethical, without resort to a divine law?
Where democracy and the making of laws comes in, but also beyond that, there's moral discussions and debate, and those kind of mechanisms operate anyway. They operate even now in our societies, and we see that as a healthy way. I mean, for instance, this whole business of Alfie in Liverpool is generating masses of debate about the moralities involved and whether it's right to keep a child alive when he may be suffering.
Euthanasia.
Not euthanasia, but
No, I'm not aware of this.
I think as a society we're quite clear that euthanasia is not acceptable. But as a society, when it comes to prolonging life unnecessarily, then I think there is another growing acceptance and
Yes, in Islam we would say prolonging life would be favoured as opposed to euthanasia.
prolonging life where life is intolerable or meaningless in some way. These are very difficult issues, but the whole question of assisted dying is another one. So this is not the same as assisted dying. Assisted dying is when people come to a conclusion their own lives are intolerable and they want help to terminate it.
So just to finalise, not to prolong
Humanists
this.
think that is something given
As a universal rule, the universal rule here would be humanists believe whatever a community has consensus on would be considered as the societal norm and morally acceptable. Is that correct?
Well, there's the golden rule, and there's the whole question of the test being the welfare of the individuals of that society.
So, before we move on, in pre-Islamic Arabia, they would bury daughters alive, and that was accepted in that community at that time.
They did it in ancient Greece as well.
But would that, if humanist philosophy was around at that time and people accepted that, would that be acceptable?
If humanist philosophy was around at that time, it's very unlikely that practice would have.
So, what would be the source of humanist philosophy? Because you've just said that a consensus would formulate a moral and ethical. So a consensus is formed of people's opinion. So in that time, people did have that opinion. But what would be the source of modern humanist morals and ethics? Is it not sourced in religion?
No, it's sourced in the basic compassion that we have as individuals living with each other in society.
So would the people in that society would they have had compassion or not?
Well, they obviously didn't when it came to their daughters that they wanted to expose.
There is also human right of the daughter to be buried. The humanists believe in the human right of people.
Yeah.
So you can't really bury someone and taking their human right to life.
Meaning, by definition, humanists are people who believe in human rights. But what we're trying to define here is the parameters of rights. What we're trying to, meaning, for one group of people, a certain thing may be considered a right, and another group of people, that is not a right. So, how with those...
The Universal Declaration and the European Convention are universal rights.
And which
the European Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
I wouldn't say they're universal, because Europe has its history. Because we're going to go into politics and history now. Europe has its long colonial history of human rights abuses, even currently speaking. And I don't think Europe alone has the moral upper ground to define what human rights should be. It's enforced. Certain things are enforced. Even the United Nations, you have 5 nations that can veto anything and against anyone. You have Russia, America, UK, German, very Eurocentric and Anglo-centric nations. But they have power of vetoing and even the term third world. These things are, again, third world, second world, third world, we'd say developing countries maybe, but that's mainly because the infrastructure of those... We would say the infrastructure of those countries was decimated during colonial times, and those... We're going into a different... So thanks for just the... No, because we're... No, of course, but because we're discussing the parameters of human rights and... Because we're discussing the parameters of human rights and how those human rights are determined, I'm discussing how historically what was the development, because there's a note here as well regarding the historical development of religion. Likewise, we would want to know what was the historical development of humanism throughout the ages. I think we're getting, those who are interjecting from the audience, you will have the opportunity to speak as well, because no Muslims are interjecting here. And you are Muslim?
Of course I am.
Okay.
So should we go to page 4 and talk about that point?
Can you be a Muslim humanist as well? Is that possible? By definition? Yes, you can. Yes.
You believe in God. There are plenty of Jewish humanists and Jewish atheists. That is to say, they're Jewish by culture, but they're not by religion. So yes, thank you for mentioning that, Asrar, because I think that one of the critical things for us as humanists is to accept the scientific and the academic findings about the origins of religion, which are so useful when it comes to our understanding of the phenomenon of religion in our society and across the world. And we see religion as arising as part of Homo sapiens' acquisition of language about 60 to 100,000 years ago. Once those people, those hunter-gatherers, had language, they were able to sit around their campfires at night and talk about their experiences, their worries about the weather, storms, earthquakes, tsunamis, predation by animals, wars with other groups. All of these things can be discussed. You can't even discuss it until you have language. And once our ancestors got language, that's when they began to think about what might be causing their difficulties, what they're afraid of.
Of course, that would the development of language is a debatable issue, because even the evolution of language is something so sophisticated that to this day Darwinian evolution theory has not satisfactorily explained what how and what the actual development, when it should, meaning the development of the mind as well as language,
The development of the mind, I agree. The development of the mind and the development
which relates to language and communication.
I agree with you, yes.
So that this would be more to do with the presumption, not really certainty.
I read it that the archaeologists and paleologists and all these people who've looked, and evolutionary psychologists, they don't have huge amounts of evidence, but there is archaeological evidence, for instance, of the development of grave goods in graves. Now, that only started about 60,000 years ago. So that suggests or shows that at that stage, humans started to think that something might be going on after death, because they thought that their person they were burying needed some grave goods.
But whether that had a divine origin, meaning in terms of revelation, that would relate more to the actual existence of God, so which we're going to move on to now.
Yeah. I mean, so just to complete the thought, what we see from that evidence and that thinking, that academic study, is that the origins of religion are likely to have been associated with that development in consciousness and mental.
Can you give us a gloss on the footnote that you placed at the bottom of page 2?
Yes. I noticed that in one of your YouTube video clips, which you'll be glad to hear, I listened to with interest. He's that famous, isn't it? You talked about evolution, and you suggested that evolution was uncertain as a field of knowledge because of the possibility of a paradigm shift, I think is the phrase you used, which you said occurs in science naturally, might actually undermine evolutionary thought. Have I got that right?
In fact, Richard Dawkins, who you admire, in The Devil's Chaplain, his work, says something not too dissimilar to what I was saying. He says evolution theory in 100 years may be so changed that we would not even recognize evolution theory.
This is the truth with all science, isn't it? All science proceeds by experimentation. And
The example you gave was of Newtonian physics and Einstein's theory of relativity, and how it may have, I would say, commended as opposed to amended. But evolution...
It improved the existing understanding.
I would say regarding that, the evolution theory, and this would be not a good comparison, because evolution theory would not fall under something that is quantifiable in the way physical theories relating to physics are, meaning E equals mc squared, for instance, is totally different to an inductive presumption of evolution theory. They're two totally different things.
What I'd like to do is to leave my friend David to pursue this.
Yeah, that's fine. That's absolutely fine.
So going to page 5, I've really discussed that. I've discussed that. So let's talk about my first question.
On page 5.
On page, sorry, I've got a different numbering on this. The next page. First set of questions.
Question 1A.
Question 1A. Now, you'll see that there's a sort of intro in there, which is really what I think you're perhaps not looking at properly. Because let's ask the question. But you'll see my 3 paragraphs is where I think, the Islamic tradition and actually the Catholic tradition is wrong. So you say that an infinite progression of causes is logically absurd, but why is it absurd or more absurd than a self-sufficient cause is the question. And I've made several comments on that. So
Do you want to read out the comments as well?
yes. So the comments are: in our daily life, we do not observe anything that is uncaused or not contingent. We never observe anything that causes itself. That idea involves something like magic, that it just doesn't obey the laws of nature. Having said that, scientists do talk about quantum fluctuations which appear to be particles jumping into and out of reality. This depends still on how you feel do observe is what appears to be natural causation. Everything that is around us, including ourselves, appears to have been caused or developed or grown from something else. We actually don't see anything popping out of existence from nothing. We see ourselves, we are actually a rearrangement of atoms as a result of our parents conceiving us and then growing, taking on food, etc. All of that is a rearrangement, a change, if you like. We're contingent on that process. And so the same applies to the natural world, and even the material world has over eons developed, changed as a result of causation. And that causation certainly goes back to the Big Bang. We see that. That is something we see. We are familiar with that. At the Big Bang, however, or just after it, scientists as a whole say that their models, their theories, and even the laws of the physical world break down. And they do not know what happened before, if there was a before the Big Bang. So as humanists, we like to follow the science as far as we can. We follow it to that point. Beyond that point, we do not know, and we intellectually want to say we don't know.
Okay.
Rather than allow faith or some other ideas to come in to destroy.
Just to repeat the question, your question was, you say that an infinite regression of causes is logically absurd, but why is it absurd or more absurd than a self-sufficient cause? So, as theists, we would say there is a self-sufficient cause of all observed phenomenon around us, everything around us, which is regarding what physical entities and those things which we observe which have a contingent nature. Now your question here, the first thing is regarding, in answering your question, I would say the impossibility of continuous regression of contingent things, meaning anything which has an accidental or an incidental nature cannot continue ad infinitum. That would be impossible because of its. That's our position on that. So because the observed universe is something composed of contingents and something of a non-infinite nature, therefore the universe itself cannot be self-sufficient. Now you mentioned Occam's razor. That Occam's razor would apply to your position, which is, meaning finding the shortest explanation would be a continuation of everything. But I would say Occam's razor would apply to our explanation, which would stop the infinite regress of contingent things, because an infinite regress of contingent things would be a rational impossibility. So Occam's razor would say a self-sufficient cause. But by saying now later on in the questions, you mentioned something similar to previous philosophers where they said that we are cloaking the ontological argument in a different guise, which is that a self-sufficient cause is really a sleight of hand and placing something in order to present as a. But the Occam's razor would be more in our favor, because you did write here, you wrote, before the Big Bang as a part of an eternally oscillating universe, towards the bottom of the eternally oscillating universe.
As some scientists theorize. It's a theory, not some science.
So an eternally.
It's not something we believe, incidentally. What we're saying as humanists is we do not know, as a human race, we do not know the answer. But we think it's wrong for faith to posit one as opposed to other possible answers.
From two propositions. One is from the observed contingencies that we see, there are two propositions, meaning two choices. Either there is an eternally oscillating universe, or there is a self-sufficient eternal cause. These are two options people have.
No, they are two options that we can see. We do not know whether there are other options.
But Occam's razor would apply to our explanation. Why?
Yes, it
Because
does. It applies to your, because you are inventing a body, namely a God, which often
But you've written
saying the simplest explanation is the right one. The simplest explanation is that if you're going to say there is an uncaused being, well, why is the universe not that? We don't know. That could easily be the uncaused being, if there is one.
again, by saying, if we say the eternally oscillating universe is the continuous cause of everything around us, this would lead us back to the initial question. So until something better is provided than saying that a self-sufficient eternal cause, as opposed to an oscillating universe. Why? The main reason behind this is because an oscillating universe would entail a continuation of contingents and a regress into eternality, which would be absurd, logically and rationally.
Well, I understand that is the Islamic and indeed the Catholic contingent argument.
And I also mentioned.
We just think that's wrong.
I also mentioned.
To jump to that because it's contradictory with the.
I also mentioned the impossibility of an infinite regress of contingent things. How? Because if we have an infinite regress of contingent things, what that would entail is that infinite regress, would it be possible to have additions to that? If you say yes, because currently if the universe was eternal, we are additions to that eternal and pre-eternal. A pre-eternal, by its very definition, cannot have additions. Likewise, if we divide the pre-eternal, and we say that by dividing the pre-eternal universe, and we divide its time, by dividing something known as a pre-eternal, that would go against its very definition. So you can never have a pre-eternal universe.
I don't follow that argumentation at all. It seems to me that prior to the Big Bang, there may have been a big crunch, and there may be an eternal oscillating universe. There may be a multiverse.
I'll clarify what I mean. By saying a crunch, the crunch could have occurred, let's say, 5 billion times prior. But by saying an eternal universe, that would mean it has been happening for pre-eternity. So by definition,
for pre-eternity, I don't understand that.
Pre-eternity would mean to no stop.
Yeah.
In the past.
So, yeah. Oh, I see.
So to no.
Eternity is in the future, and pre-eternity is in the
yes. So to no stop in the past, the universe has been oscillating, growing, and then crunching, and then expanding and crunching. That number of times, the number of times that has happened, would we be able to divide that number? If we are able to divide that number, that would entail that there is no pre-eternity, because pre-eternity by definition can never be divided.
No, I don't accept that at all, because whether we can divide something or not is irrelevant to whether it's happened or not. It either has happened.
All numbers are divisible.
The fact that we can't divide it is neither here nor there.
No, we would say the number of times that has happened. If I say
just also there is a point here, and that is that we're speculating about things that are beyond our comprehension, beyond scientific or knowledge. They are things that are only discussed in the mind. They're ideas that are discussed philosophically. They're not ideas that are rooted in reality in the sense that science has achieved some understanding of them.
You see,
and therefore, in a sense, it's impermissible, not impermissible, but there's no point in trying to work one's way around these ideas, which are all, at the end of the day, unsatisfactory.
What I would say to that is the proposition that I have given is more plausible than claiming that in pre-eternality the universe has been oscillating, because that would entail a number of times, and any number can never be pre-eternal.
I agree it's unsatisfactory, but it's also as unsatisfactory, it seems to me, I think it's less unsatisfactory than positing a necessary being. There's no such thing as a necessary.
Again, the being is not, you use the word being or divine being. Here, the being is not posited in the way this argument was worded, because the argument is worded with that there is a cause for the universe. Now, by saying the universe is a cause of itself, that would entail that the universe is oscillating or it's causing itself. And that is more absurd than saying there is a cause external to the universe, if we can say external.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so we're talking about absurdities. There's two absurdities we're talking about. It seems to be absurd to be speculating about absurdities, and it's also absurd to believe in one or the other.
The other one
The
would...
right thing to do is not to believe in.
Why I would say our proposition is not absurd is because self-sustaining, you've acceded that there is something that can be self-sustaining. But we're saying the self-sustaining universe cannot be something contingent in nature. Cannot be, because contingencies by the definition can never be self-sustaining. So it's a cause that is not contingent.
Well, there are scientists who take the view that quantum physics is so bizarre and extraordinary that it may indicate how a natural origin of the universe happened without external cause. Now, they're nowhere near showing that has happened, but the point is that's yet another...
And I propose that they will never be able to show that, because
You may be right.
what we've proposed is very logical to say there is a cause, but the cause can never be contingent, because contingencies by their very nature are very ephemeral, meaning short-lived.
But still, I go back to the point that we have never seen anything that's self-caused, whereas we do see things that are caused by other things all the time.
So now we move on to a different domain, which is vision of the original cause of the universe. I would say again, this on our part would be a deductive argument. In philosophy, it would be inductive. But because we are realists, as opposed to David Hume, we would say our argument is deductive, and therefore, a posteriori, we have deduced that there is a cause for the universe, and vision of that cause is not necessary.
I see how you get there within the logic that you have, and I used to believe that myself until my 40s, when I came to the conclusion that it wasn't a good enough explanation.
It's not an isolated explanation.
And the better explanation is that we do not know the answer, and we should not try to guess it or have faith.
No, but what I would say to that is, if it was isolated to the argument from contingency or the cosmological argument, in that case, you may be right in the sense that how do we conclude that there is a God and whatnot, but it's not based on one argument, meaning the belief in God. We are discussing one argument, but there are numerous arguments that we can discuss, but currently your questions relate just to the argument from contingency, and what I am proposing is that the objections to the argument from contingency can be rationally countered.
So that's where we leave that particular discussion, seems to me, because there are other arguments that can easily also be discussed, and I think it might be an interesting follow-up to have a series on, the
of course,
arguments, the ontological arguments, the design arguments, all of these other arguments, which are fascinating, and at the end of the day, once you've taken a view on these arguments, then you can decide what you believe. Okay, so are we moving on to another question?
totally up to you.
Well, we've got 1B.
1B was covered by default.
And so the second set of questions looks at the same sort of discussion from different arguments. And what we're saying there is that your argument depends on an assumption that before the universe happened, there was nothing, and absolutely nothing. What we're saying is that is an assumption which actually cannot be sustained. that we do not know that even it's possible for there to be absolute nothing. So my question is, do you accept you are unwarranted in making the assumption that the default status is nothing, out of which something was created, when absolute nothing may in fact be impossible, and the default may as easily be something, not nothing at all? And to be, we might as well take the other one at the same time, because it's related. In order to prove the existence of a creator, are you not positing the existence of a cause of material creation ex nihilo, meaning out of nothing, when in fact no such thing has ever been shown to be possible? So you see how it's related to our previous discussion.
How I would respond to that is, firstly, when we say there is something, it's something that we observe. As the only group that may have opposed the real existence of the external universe are people who have belief in solipsism or any other philosophy that there is no external realm. So we believe, like you said at the beginning, that the external universe actually does exist. So from observing the known universe, we observe that its nature is very limited. So we go back to the initial argument that the very nature of the universe being limited and coming into existence and out of existence, we observe things coming into existence and going out of existence. The parts of the universe that we observe going in and out of existence would entail the entire universe is of such a nature. So does this universe need a self-sufficient cause, or is it self-sufficient? So we go back to the original argument, saying, we would say it has a self-sufficient eternal cause, while you would say it is an oscillating universe, maybe, or
No, we're not saying
maybe.
We're not saying anything. We're saying we do not know, and it's right, and it's most intellectual.
I think David wants to interject.
Just a very speedy clarification. When you use the word observable, exactly what do you mean by that?
Observable would be anything that we observe with our eyes or by using telescopes, microscopes, anything of that category. Actually observable.
Things popping into existence and out of existence in that. I don't think we do observe that except in the quantum field, which is a special case. So what we observe in the universe.
We do see imploding stars and the new formation of stars.
That's right.
And black holes exist.
Those are not ex nihilo, are they?
They are not ex nihilo, but it does. With black holes, it's a different argument because reality of black holes is unknown to this day. But they do, what we do deduce from that is that they have a contingent reality, which is a very limited ephemeral reality.
But I mean, the history of the universe from the Big Bang has been
Even the Big Bang is very theoretical. I mean, 13.4 billion years is based on the observation of the expansion of the universe from our point.
Yes, and the microwave back.
We would again, this would all fall under assumptions.
It's a model.
Yeah, it's a model of the universe.
Which only goes to reinforce the point that we're making, which is there is a deficit of knowledge.
There is a deficit of knowledge in the sense of our observed universe, but we would say a self-sufficient eternal cause is a better explanation than saying that the universe is a contingent oscillating universe that continues forever.
But clearly that's your view, but it's not our view for the reasons that I've given, which is that because there is an absence of adequate knowledge,
you see, it would lead to
it's wrong to adopt essentially a faith position.
It would lead to a regress of momentarily existing things that are not independent in their
You made
nature.
that point already, but
Yeah. So it leads to that.
That's your point, and it's a valid point. And my point is we don't know, and we shouldn't try to.
David,
Just a quick question again. Using your own definition for the word observable, would you say that you had observed the supernatural or the
God himself.
the immaterial? No. I'm not using the word God.
Immaterial,
Have you observed
the metaphysical realm.
Have you? Yes, indeed. Have you observed it?
Again, the metaphysical realm and the unseen realm is based on belief in that is based on revelation.
Okay.
It's not based on my observation.
Not observed it.
No, we don't claim that as well. As for supernatural miracles, using the word supernatural meaning as miracles are defined as suspension of the norm, those have been observed by certain humans and other humans have not observed. We can move on to that later in the questions and answers.
Do we go on to the third set of questions? I'm anxious that anybody else has a chance to talk as well. So I make the same point again that you're going beyond what science has ascertained by saying that the universe began to exist. And then the idea of creation ex nihilo is language that sneaks in a creator, we say, into the premise.
Which number is this?
This is the third set of questions.
So 3A.
Yeah, 3A. So that's what we think of as circular reasoning. And also, because there is in fact 3B, no certain knowledge about these matters, but you're claiming, to have a position based on essentially faith and also your internal logic. It seems to us that you're committing the fallacies of argument from ignorance and God of the gaps fallacies. That is to say, you're putting God into it to try and fill a gap in the scientific understanding. And that is
Shall I respond to
another
that?
way, really, of saying what we've been saying all along.
Shall I respond to that? Firstly, Immanuel Kant, in fact, was the one to suggest that people using the cosmological argument are cloaking the cosmological argument and are making the ontological argument re-enter from the back door. This is words to that effect.
Yeah.
But here I would say, regarding your point on...
And he also debunked the ontological argument quite...
I don't agree with the ontological argument. So...
Let's we don't agree with it.
But here, what I would say regarding this, regarding God of the gaps, you see, science by its very nature is, like we agreed upon. I think you've listened to my lectures on definition of science and how we accept science in the sense that observation and experiment and explanation of how things work is not something that contradicts our belief system. So if we observe something or we experiment with something, observation and experiment can never go against my belief system. So as you've said, that the theoretical physics today does not contradict Islamic theology in any way or form. Meaning...
No, I'm not saying that it contradicts. It might do. That would be a completely different discussion.
Until...
But what I'm saying is that Islamic theology goes beyond science in a way that isn't justified.
How it would be justified to us is that we are claiming that, like I said before, this is an a posteriori conclusion, not something a priori that we believe and then we look for a God, which God of the gaps would suggest. That God of the gaps, this term would mean that when there is no explanation, a person just fills up the gap with God. But what we are doing is a posteriori making a deductive argument. In philosophy, it would be inductive. But why we say deductive is based upon the fact that we are truists, meaning we believe things exist, and from them we deduce other things. Unlike David Hume, who did not hold that position, but if fire burnt me, Taftazani, the Muslim theologian, responds to this, even though later Thomas Reid and others gave the same answer, that if fire burns me, I know fire exists, I know I exist. So based on that, we deduce a posteriori that there is a cause, self-sufficient cause for the universe. How we move on to Allah and the Quran, and that's a totally different discussion.
It's a different discussion, I agree. And actually, you've raised a fascinating thought that I have in relation to this whole argument, which is that, firstly, God of the gaps, for for us, is putting God into beyond where science ends. But for you, God of the gaps doesn't apply because you have what you call logical and deductive arguments to cover that area. And that brings me to back to the thought that one feature I notice of religious belief and theology is the belief in ideas as sufficient to plug these gaps. So, for instance, ideas of necessary beings, God, the idea of absolutes, the idea of nothing, absolute nothing. These are all mental constructs that humans have developed, but then none of them are actually things that we experience in reality. And that's our objection to them, that you religious folk go beyond what is right in terms of knowledge into the realm of ideas to plug the gaps in what is observable and scientifically ascertainable.
Yeah, in response to that, I would say with science, there is a scope of science that is, meaning the limits of science is something that we can discuss as well, meaning what are the actual limitations to human science and how much can science actually explain. So when we go beyond that, the metaphysical question regarding things that science can never explain, that human beings, Muslims or other religious people fill those gaps with religious beliefs, that would be based on revelation as opposed to human thinking. Even though as an atheist you would say revelation is human thinking, maybe from the subconscious mind.
But let's be clear that we agree that science has its limitations.
Yes, science does have limitations, of course.
We agree with that.
Like human beings have limitations.
And beyond that, we say, skepticism, atheism,
But we would say our conclusion is deductive regarding the self-sufficient cause. It's an accumulative argument that is, the argument is not only from cosmology, it can go from providence, meaning human experience from childhood to adulthood, where a person has personal experience that he himself or herself is not maintained by themselves, but someone else is maintaining them. But these are subjective arguments.
They are, but the deductive arguments that you're maintaining, which are a distinguished tradition, let's be clear about that. I'm not trying to deny that. It's a distinguished tradition that goes back at least 1,000 years. It's still dependent, isn't it, on mental constructs. The idea of God, the idea of nothing, the idea of the necessary being. These are ideas that have been created, invented by the human mind.
We would say deductive certainties. The human mind has a deductive certainty that there is a God.
So that's where we disagree. But
Yeah.
But it's very, I find this a fascinating and useful way of discussing it. Are people following it? Is this good? Yeah? Yeah? Okay. So should we just round off with the last set?
It's entirely up to you if your audience has patience, our audience has patience.
The last set.
I have to put up with the interrogations today, not you.
This set has gone beyond four. The fourth set of questions do try to address some of the revelation and Allah's role. And of course, if we were with a Christian audience or a Jewish audience, it would be, their concept of God. Am I right in thinking that the Abrahamic God is the same Father?
You see, the term Abrahamic faith would, for some people, would entail that the origin of Islam and Judaism and Christianity has its origins in Abraham. But we would say that the same religion has been from the time of Adam. So from Adam until the Prophet of Islam, the same religion, which is the belief in one true God, with different revelations to different prophets. So it may have undergone human changes, meaning people tampered with the religion and its original teachings, and then
I'm familiar with
this way of thinking. Yeah. So Abrahamic faiths, meaning the three main monotheistic religions of the world, they do have the same God, except that Christianity believes Jesus is the Son of God, so we move on to a different realm where they believe in a human manifestation of God.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, whatever your criticisms of Christianity are, I'm likely to agree with them. And I'm likely to go beyond that. But let's leave that aside. I'm just thinking, I think we've probably had a good enough discussion not to go into further into the fourth set of questions. So I'm going to leave the floor open.
Very much appreciated, and thank you for your input.
Well, thank you as well. It's a bit like this.
Are we moving on to David's questions?
Good evening, everybody. My name is David Milne. I'm a member of the Great Imagined Humanists. I visit schools and talk about humanism and what we represent and so on, so forth. Following on from a guy here, I'm going to be very much shorter because I think you all need it, to be honest with you. But that was, really, really interesting, you guys, by the way. So I thought maybe some audience participation might be interesting at this point. So I'm going to ask you, by a show of hands, who accepts the theory of evolution in this hall? Excellent. Okay, so that's very good. Not everybody, but lots of, it's about half, isn't it? So that's really good. Of the people who raised your hands, could I ask you to put your hands up if you're a Muslim? Will that make any difference to you? So if you just put your hand up so I can see.
Very few.
1, 2, 3.
Very few.
Very, very few, yeah. So
David, that would show you.
I suppose that I'm disappointed.
Yeah, your point wasn't proven there because I think you were trying to say that Muslims are mainly the people who reject evolution, but the people who put their hands up as being Muslim were less than the people who put their hands up saying they reject the theory of evolution.
No, I asked them whether they accepted it. I didn't ask them if they rejected it. I asked them if they accepted it as right.
Meaning they're agnostics regarding evolution.
So, yeah.
Agnostic.
So, I suppose I want to ask a question, and I can ask it of everybody, so you can all get involved, because otherwise you're going to sit here listening to old people talking all evening.
Old people, David.
Well, I refer to myself.
I've got a beard.
A young person over here, if you shave the beard off, given that the great universities and the great natural history museums of the world all teach evolution by means of natural selection, given that the Roman Catholic Church and the Church of England, and indeed I would say many Muslims also accept evolution by means of natural selection, is it not the case that your opposition to evolution is because to cover the fact that you don't actually have any scientific evidence for the existence of Allah?
Thanks for your question, David. Firstly, you've really discredited your question by mentioning the Catholic Church, because if we're going to discuss rationally, that would entail that whatever the Catholic Church agrees upon or would be something scientific. So we know that the Catholic Church takes certain theological positions that are totally irrational. Like we mentioned one theological position regarding children going to hell. As for, you mentioned the great universities and natural history museums of the world. When you say of the world, would that be of Europe and America, or would that include Africa, Asia, and the rest of the world?
Well, very good question.
Because the world is much larger than London Natural Museum.
Yes. Absolutely. But pretty much...
It goes back to my Eurocentric point.
From all the countries, all over the world, accept and teach evolution by means of natural selection.
You said the entire world.
Yes.
Would that mean in the Middle East and Africa, would the universities and the museums there accept, meaning is there a universal worldwide consensus, or would you say there is a...
I think...
because for me...
I think I'm prepared to say I would use the word universal.
For me, for instance, the Qarwiyin is the oldest university in the world.
The
Qarwiyin. Have you heard of the Qarwiyin?
No.
It's the oldest university in the world.
Yes.
Did you know that?
No.
1200 years old.
Yes.
No, Al-Azhar came after. Al-Azhar is 800 years old. In fact, it was established by the Fatimid dynasty, Al-Azhar, and then Salahuddin Ayyubi made it into a more established university. But prior to that, Fatima Fehriya established the oldest university in the world, which is still active today, which is in Fars, and it's a university, and they don't teach theory of evolution. So when you say the great universities of the world, can you please qualify that? Do you mean Oxford, Cambridge,
American universities,
yes,
German universities, French universities, Chinese universities.
Chinese communist.
But my question
Chinese
was,
communist universities.
my question-
Meaning, when we say with regard to China, if you notice, I didn't mention China because China would not permit any university not teaching something that goes against the theory of evolution. So I would exclude China due to its communist regime.
Yes, but you...
So what I'm saying is your question...
They actually teach evolution by means of...
David, what I would say...
natural selection.
What I would say
That's
is...
a fact. So my question was, isn't it true that your opposition to evolution is because to cover the fact that you don't actually have any scientific evidence for the existence of Allah?
Moving on to your...
That's my question.
I'm going to answer your question. The second part of your question, which is this part, is that my rejection of evolution theory is due to the fact that I cannot scientifically prove the existence of Allah. Your question will be answered two-pronged. I'm going to give two answers. One is that the theory of evolution, even if I acknowledge the theory of evolution, it would not entail rejection of a creator.
Good.
It would not entail, because a person who believes, even Christian theologians who've accepted the theory of evolution, like the Catholic Church and other Christian theologians, and you mentioned Muslims, even though I would say no Muslim theologian of prominence, distinction meaning of prominence, has accepted that as a creedal point, or in order to explain the Quran, of prominence, not isolated scientists, Muslim scientists. Even if someone acknowledges the theory of evolution, it would not entail the non-existence of... If someone accepted it, it would not entail the non-existence of God. Secondly, the scientific evidence for Allah, as you've been listening to my and Guy's discussion, we've said that science has a very limited scope. And Guy and me agreed on this. We do not say that the belief in Allah is a scientific theory, and this is something Richard Dawkins on a regular basis makes a mistake in when he critiques the existence of God. He critiques it as a scientific theory. I said it's based on...
To go back to your word observable.
I said it's...
You used the word observable.
I said...
So my question was, have you observed the supernatural or...
I said to you that...
And God has to be either supernatural and or
what I said
immaterial.
was...
Therefore you have no evidence for Allah.
What I said...
It's not reasonable.
No, because what I said to you is that the belief in God is an a posteriori deductive argument, which is based... And when you make a deductive argument, it's based from things that you observe. For instance, evolution theory itself evolution theory itself, did you observe creatures developing and going through a cycle of evolution, or was that an inductive argument based upon the remains and of skeletons and different things?
Science is
Which one would you say?
A deductive process.
Not always. Some scientific theories are inductive and do not impart certainty. Meaning,
would you not support, for example, the prosecution of, for example, murderers?
Exactly.
I'm sure you would.
But you don't see that.
Most murders are actually carried out when there are no people
So
there.
you don't.
So therefore, we use science to convict a murderer.
So, but
is that not fair?
That is fair. Why? So it proves my point regarding a deductive argument regarding God. Meaning, it's not necessary that you see the murderer killing someone, but you know he's the murderer. You didn't see him, so observation is not always necessary in order to believe in something.
And therefore, in order to discover the murderer, you
make
have to
deductive arguments.
Science.
Not always.
Oh.
No. Do you watch episodes of Columbo? Does he always use
well, I'm
science?
at that age, the beard gives the game away. Really.
But
it's very boring.
It's not always based on deductive arguments using science. A detective can use other means
Could you give us the reasons why you don't accept evolution?
Okay, now we go on to...
And maybe we could open it up to the audience, who must be very bored of hearing me speak now as well.
Okay, we'll stop there if you don't...
Yeah, sure.
We'll stop at that point. I'll answer his point. What I mentioned regarding evolution theory was that when we observe scientific data, the information that's received sometimes may convince an individual, and sometimes it may be an inductive argument that proposes a scientific theory. The classification I gave to evolution theory was an inductive argument that does not impart certainty. And for me, it does not impart certainty. So the inductive the data presented for evolution theory, the inductive argument made from that is not the same for me as a deductive argument for God. But even if I accepted evolution theory, it would not affect my belief in God, because God could be the creator of such a process. But the reason for rejection of evolution theory is based upon the inductive reasoning of those who try popularizing evolution theory today. Meaning the popularization, I've read popular books on evolution theory, and even the books of Richard Dawkins, when you read them, a lot of rhetoric is used.
I've read them all.
Pardon?
I have read them all. Dawkins.
Yeah, the blind watchmaker and all these other words. Meaning he uses a lot of metaphor. True?
No.
Of course he does. He
uses
when he
metaphor
discusses,
as explanation,
but it's not. It's
based upon a
inductive argument.
Scientific explanation.
Inductive argument.
Okay, let's struggle on with this for a moment. I'm going to give you a picture, and two pictures actually, and I suppose it's a little bit unfair of me really, but anyway, here we go. You need an answer, and I will explain this to the audience. So there's a pair of pictures there, and there's one there. What I'm showing the Sheikh is a picture of a whale that's broken a leg. Now, I don't just mean a protuberance, ladies and gentlemen, I mean a leg. Now, whales are marine animals, they live in the water. What possible use could a whale have for a leg? It shows that a common ancestor that gave rise to the whale.
David.
Had legs.
David.
Was that?
David, here.
I'm just going to
No. Before you go on a tangent, I'm going to have to stop you. I'll tell you why. No, you can say your part. Just give me a minute.
Go back.
when you quote my position on evolution theory, did you listen to my position correctly, or did you listen to it partially? I'll tell you why.
You can explain it to me. You don't have to ask me whether I understood it. You can explain it.
All right, let me explain.
Go.
Okay. When I lectured on evolution theory, I mentioned that I reject common ancestry.
Yeah.
Common ancestry. Let me finish. David, common ancestry.
Yes.
I rejected
humans.
I rejected human evolution. Yes.
Okay.
And here, what you're presenting is a whale, a picture of a whale with limbs.
Yeah.
Now, a whale with limbs does not contradict me in any way or form. So even if you present a horse or a large horse, I'll say, even if that's possible, it doesn't affect belief in God.
No.
Are you understanding that point? Because the belief of a human evolution.
You say that if you accepted evolution, it wouldn't make any difference to your belief in God. But the point is, you don't disagree with it.
Now you need to be very specific regarding human evolution. Human evolution.
Yeah. So
you accept non-human evolution?
Again, it's something inductive, and scientists may find a limb on a whale, or it doesn't really affect our belief if we see an animal going through an evolutionary process. It doesn't contradict our revelation. But human origins are what we say are decisive.
But we're not talking about revelation. I'm suggesting that the leg of the whale contradicts your anti-evolution.
Again, David, when you say anti-evolution, you must be very specific. We say humans do not have common origin with other creatures.
Yes.
Humans.
Why do you say that?
Based on revelation.
What's a science? No science. Then.
Based on revelation.
So
and the
no
scientific
science.
proof.
So no science.
Again, David.
Is that reasonable?
The scientific proof presented for human evolution is not sufficient for me.
Okay. So this picture here, ladies and gentlemen, and I've brought some more. Is of a. But yes, would you like to speak, sir? Go ahead.
So you're saying the fact that this whale has a leg is proof that it's actively evolving.
No, I'm saying that the common ancestry of a marine living animal that has the information contained within the embryo to enable it to grow a leg demonstrates.
This is like
let me finish this. Common ancestry to an animal that was able to grow legs. You can't simply put into an embryo the ability to grow legs. And
this is like saying
what usually
vestigial organs or something indicates towards a common ancestry with other animals. I'm saying even if there are vestigial organs, I'm saying the inductive process of reasoning by seeing and observing limbs on a whale and
which is not scientific,
and making observation of a limb on a whale. Observation of a limb on a whale is one thing, but making the conclusion that therefore me and the whale have the same ancestor is an error.
I never said that. I didn't actually say that.
No, common ancestry means
here's the picture of
this is what common ancestry
means.
means.
The second picture.
As well as
it's
David,
two of them.
David, as well as
born with tails, which had to be removed. Now that demonstrates common ancestry with a
historically speaking, David,
have the ability to grow tails.
David,
primates do not grow tails. We are primates.
David, can we have a conversation here?
Yeah. Well,
I think everyone's
everyone's
educated here enough to have studied Darwinian theory in school and college and university. What I want to ask you, David, is in the past there have been examples of fraudulent cases.
Of course.
Yes. So this article that you present, I've not gone and verified this. I've not gone and observed. I've not gone and observed.
I agree entirely with you.
Exactly.
presented it to you now so that you
But,
may take it away with you and investigate.
A limb on a whale.
Very well. Is common ancestry.
A limb on a whale would not make me conclude that there is no God.
Over.
I'm going to read this in my own time.
Just for the audience.
Yeah. So a limb on a whale does not make me conclude that there is no God.
What about a tail on a human?
Yes.
A tail on a human and a human being.
Yes. They are. They are. It's on
The
there.
meaning. So a tail.
Just in front of you.
A tail on a human being would entail what? No pun intended. What would it entail? What would it entail? I'm saying to you,
Entail that had common ancestry.
again, you made a God of the gaps type of jump. You made a
No, I
jump.
haven't.
So if we observe a tail on a human being, it does not make me conclude that human beings have common ancestry with apes or anything else.
One of the problems is that
It's not convincing.
Going into a wide-ranging discussion here, when really we should have a whole section just on evolution.
Yeah, we should.
Okay, now it's nearly 8 o'clock. I'm
Yeah,
going to
yeah.
open up for our
Yeah,
audience, and the organizers.
Yeah, I
The
agree.
organizers are going to select whoever speaks. Don't worry, non-Muslims are given priority. So in case you think it's so, David, you know this is totally not a fix. Meaning we're very open here. There's nothing.
Thank you very much. But I suppose that the point about the tail on the human being does rather demonstrate common ancestry with animals that had tails. That's the point. Yes.
I'm saying that's insufficient, an insufficient conclusion. We can have a different discussion at another time regarding evolution and the scientific data and what it can conclude. This is what I'm disputing. The scientific data, we may observe certain things. We're not disputing those things which are empirically proven. What I am disputing is the conclusion drawn from what is empirically shown. So some people, with the Cambrian explosion, when they dig up to the Cambrian, they say, where's the signs of a global flood? They say, where's the signs of a global flood? Okay, we'll move on now. Are there any questions from the audience? Place your hands up, and then we had written questions, but I'm going to give priority to people present. So the written questions are reserved for another time.
So this is something I struggle with as probably call me a cultural Muslim who I don't believe, the Quran is ordained by a God. So
Repeat that again, please.
So, okay, a cultural Muslim, I'd say.
A cultural Muslim?
Yes, who struggles with the idea of an almighty creator of the universe, specifically one that created the Quran. My question is, if we require a God to create the universe because we say something comes from nothing and that's not possible, then who created God's universe? Who created God? Why isn't it reasonable? And this is a sincere question. Why isn't it reasonable to say, somebody will have created God? Because if we're saying the universe can't come from nothing, why can God come from nothing?
Okay, thanks. In response to your question, the only reason we conclude, or there are many reasons, but one of the reasons why we conclude that the observable universe stops at a self-sufficient cause is because this would lead to a regression. Now that would entail that if the God that created the universe himself needed a cause, that in effect would mean that that cause would also have a cause, and we would go back to the initial question.
But what we're saying then is God came from nothing. And
We're not saying God came from nothing.
okay,
We're saying God has always been
God
there.
has always been there.
Yes.
And the only evidence for that is because the Quran says so.
No, I've not said the Quran is the only source. I've said even human reasoning would tell us that a continuous regress would be impossible, and especially a continuous regress of something which is short-lived and contingent. It would have to stop at a self-sufficient cause.
But when we're getting into the creation of the universe, or beyond that, we're getting into quantum mechanics and physics.
No, quantum physics wouldn't apply to God because time itself. How do we define time? How do we define time? Time is what? Time is movement.
No,
and
time probably didn't exist before the universe. And I'll just finish here. I struggle with this because there is no solution to this idea that, we need God to explain the creation of the universe, but we're happy to accept that God has always been there, which to me is just wackadoodle.
The answer to that is, look, if you say that there was no self-sufficient being, in effect, some people conclude that there's always been a universe. Is that cockadoodle or not? Meaning, why are you making when it comes to a self-sufficient cause, you find that to be a cockadoodle or whatever you may term it. But if someone says that a universe that is changing, is contingent in its very nature, is not self-sufficient by observation, someone can believe that this changing universe could have existed for a pre-eternal amount of time, meaning not even time, for pre-eternal, something that changes in its very nature. But if someone comes along and says, no, there must be a self-sufficient cause, that would make more rational sense than saying the observed universe has gone on forever and forever. In fact, that it would be cockadoodle. And even the even physicists like Stephen Hawking, all his life he attempted to form a theory of everything, and was unable to do so.
Yeah, because we can't. Yeah, I mean, speak of black holes. We don't know what's going on beyond the universe. Yeah, I mean, I wish there was an answer, but the Islamic answer.
But I've given an answer.
The Islamic answer is God said so in the Quran.
No, did I give that answer? That is not the Islamic answer. The Quran says. Look what the Quran says. I'm going to read a bit of Quran in Arabic. لا تقف ما ليس لك به علم إن السمع والبصر والفؤاد كل أولئك كان عنه مسؤولا. Do not follow that which you have no knowledge. Why? Because the hearing, the sight, and the heart, all of that will be questioned. Meaning, the Quran is telling us, لا تقف ما ليس لك به علم. Do not follow that which you have no knowledge. So, by me saying to you, that's in Surah number 17 of the Quran. I've memorized the Quran, so I don't quote it from chapter number 17.
I mean, the problem I've always had with that as a Muslim,
towards the end of the chapter, I think,
is what it's basically saying is, don't look behind the veil.
No, we're not saying that.
That's essentially what it's saying. It's saying.
Have I said that? Have I said that? Has the Quran said that? No, the Quran is saying, don't follow that which you have no knowledge. Maybe some Muslims who have been brought up like this conclude that this is what Islam teaches. But there are many incorrect people who may, for instance, honor killings. So many people think honor killings are a part of Islam. But you, with knowledge, honor killings are not. But there are so many people who are under the impression that honor killings are a part of Islam. Likewise, there are some people who may be under the impression that Islam says blind faith is essential. But we're saying blind faith is not essential.
And kind of what you said contradicts what, the Quran does tell us to contemplate and look at the universe and,
exactly.
Knowledge. But you've just said, it also tells us, don't look into areas that you have no knowledge.
No, you didn't understand me quoting the Quran to you. The Quran says, don't follow anything which you have no knowledge, means do not blind follow, learn.
Of course.
This is what I'm trying to tell you. The Quran tells us learn, find out.
Which is what we're doing.
Yes.
I'm with you, and it is what we're doing and you're saying the answer is God, and I'm saying...
Again, initially, when the word God is loaded, the word...
What is in the Quran when we haven't established
the word God is a loaded word. Why?
Okay.
Because in English, I'm saying there is a self-sufficient cause for the universe.
Which is the creator.
Pardon?
The creator.
The cause is the creator, of course.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much, Shaykh, and everyone who's here at Madinah Society. I find it very interesting. I'm a cultural Christian, if I can say that. I was born in a Christian family and walked away from it after some years. And my question
to yourself and to actually absolutely everyone who continues to hold or has chosen, because you said you should follow knowledge, to have religious belief. May I ask, if you haven't been told, especially by an authority figure, about your religion and about the concept of revelation for those things that you can't come to, in other words, if you hadn't been told the story, would you ever have come up with it yourself?
Repeat that question again. Can you also qualify this term cultural Christian and cultural Muslim, because...
Oh, that's irrelevant to my question, so I'll withdraw that aspect. I just thought I would try and make a clever segue.
Because to me...
I'll just ask the question.
Because the greatest culture Muslims produced was in the first 200 years of Islam.
Sure. Okay. Well, I'll just restate my question. If each person who holds a religious belief hadn't been told the story about that religious belief, and especially told that story by an authority figure,
okay,
and hadn't been told about a method called revelation, would you ever have come up with it yourself?
Okay, thanks for your question. I understood the question now. The first thing is that this question would relate to actually observing a society where they've never heard any such thing as revelation. The only examples of such a community today I can give is in the Amazon jungle, where they've found tribes of people who have been untouched by the rest of humanity. So that question relates to sociology and sociologists checking such tribes whether there were people who claimed revelation. This is something which relates to sociology and is beyond the scope of theology. But in terms of theology, your question, in terms of theology, the question may entail the following, that this is a concept implanted by religion, meaning revelation is something which is unique to religions which are man-made. So if you believe religions are man-made, then the answer would be yes, that because man has made up, according to atheists, man has made up the myth of religion, therefore any human society would have some people claiming revelation. This would be the answer from your perspective, I would think.
Well, I'm actually asking if there is anybody who thinks they would have come up. I mean, I wasn't born into a Hindu family. I didn't come up with Hinduism. I didn't experience anything in my life outside within Christianity. I didn't experience anything external to my family and my minister telling me those stories that these were true, these authority figures telling me these things. I wouldn't have come up with any of that on my own.
The question's very subjective, meaning
any of the other religious narratives.
It's something very subjective, and
Where they come from, I just have no power in that area.
Where would they have come from?
Again, we would say they come from God Almighty. The revelation comes from God Almighty.
But we haven't been taught about a method called revelation.
Your question is very subjective, meaning if we hadn't been taught, that's something I can't answer, because we've not experienced that situation. Your answer
There are things that we can't experience, such as, for example, I can't personally prove that atoms exist. I don't have direct observation of that. I have to be told stories about it. But I do know I can go and find that, and others from very different backgrounds in different ages can result in the same conclusions. However, revelation is a process that seems to have to be explained how it works, practiced, and then it seems to come into being. And if anyone has another way,
the revelationary process is in Christianity different totally to Islam. Meaning, when revelation is described for the Prophet of Islam, it's something totally different for the biblical authors. Meaning, when the biblical authors were inspired to write by God, that very concept in Christianity is totally different to Islam. So, it's for some people do claim that the Prophet of Islam stole Christian concepts In fact, recently I had a meeting with a Christian priest and he was surprised to hear the concepts of revelation and prophethood in Islam and how there is a disparity between the two. Meaning, Muslims believe prophets are free from sin. This is one major difference. While Christians believe all the prophets from Adam all the way prior to Jesus, all the prophets were sinful.
I understand that.
So I would say to you,
I'm talking about revelation and truth, and I understand that different religious groups, different groups.
Islamic concept of revelation.
Different definition, but you did. If I'm not mistaken, did you not say earlier that where we don't have or don't need scientific proof within Islam to come to, we do it through deductive reasoning and revelation.
Revelation is unique.
If we had been told about that in the first place, would we have come up with it ourselves?
You see,
in our own, as individuals.
If we are left without revelation, let's say there's no revelation, then the Quran states, this is from the Islamic theological perspective, وَمَا كُنَّا مُعَذِّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبْعَثَ رَسُولًا. We will not punish a people until we send a messenger. Meaning, if human beings were left, and I think Guy had a question in section 4 regarding deism, that if human beings were left alone to their own doings, the Quran tells us there is no punishment for them. So these tribes in the Amazon, for instance.
But again, I think that's irrelevant. Excuse me, because whether there's punishment or not is irrelevant. Where does
what I would say,
where would revelation come from?
No one
had been told about it in the first place.
No one would conclude, if they were left alone without the Islamic story of the revelation of the Quran and the Prophet, no one would conclude with the same story. That's my answer to you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for this event. It's really insightful. I just wanted to share a few points before raising my question, which is just the last question raised was about, of course, if you were not to be born into the family or the religion you were, would you really be? I think Islam or the Quran is Islam is the only religion which actually tells its followers to actively question and refute. In fact, the Quran says if you see any mistakes in the Quran, discard it. In Surah Al-Qasas, it says, say, bring a book. If you believe it's from the Creator, then bring something like it. So it's we're not here to sort of establish this is what I think. Hey, there's more to think critically, to think honestly. But when you sort of try to refute the truth, but when you come to the conclusion that you actually can't refute it, then your conviction in it will be greater. This is the point I'm making. So everyone's going to be born a Muslim, a Christian, a Jew, I think. But the difference in being a Muslim is that you're not told to blindly follow. You're told to actively question and think critically and go above.
We have 10 minutes left, so
okay,
please.
On to my question. It's about the brothers before who were making the point about the scientific sort of stuff. The scientific method, which coincidentally was actually developed by mainly Muslims, like Ibn Haytham and all those guys. Anyway, the point is, what was believed to be scientifically proven 100 years ago, today is refuted. What is considered to be scientifically correct today, a fact, 100 years later might be disproven. So science does not sort of stance. I don't really agree with this. Scientific method is based on refutations. You keep refuting. Anyway, yeah, that makes sense. So the idea is, if you believe in God, then it's not really hard to think that God came with revelation. So it's actually, this is the absolute truth. So you can't solve. What is your question? So yeah, the scientific method itself, just having the stance which science can't be disproven. For example, a human grows a tail. Somehow, we agree, we come to the conclusion that sort of...
I think with the discussion with the guy, I kind of answered that already. That guy mentioned regarding paradigm shift, that the only thing that we believe, in terms of science, when we say something is observational or something is empirical or something is provable, that's through experimentation and observation, and this can never contradict the Quran. Observation never contradicts the Quran. Some people may misquote the Quran. For instance, the story of Dhul Qarnayn, the Quran eloquently mentions that he stopped at a lake of water and the sun was setting in the muddy lake of water. This is referring to his observation of the horizon. So some polemical people tend to misquote that verse of the Quran. The Quran is not saying that the sun sets in a muddy spring. If someone quotes that, they will only make themselves look silly in front of a Muslim audience. But the Quran never contradicts observational facts. Well, the only thing that an atheist may be able to debate with us is whether God can suspend the laws of physics or suspend the norm, and that would go into the arena of miracles. But that question of miracles would revert back to the existence of God, and then we go back to the initial argument.
So you partially answered my question, which I haven't raised yet, which was, to what extent sort of do we take science until sort of...
Again, to a very, like I said, to a very limited scope where we believe in scientific advancement. We do not have an insecurity of science ever overthrowing religion. In fact, the only reason for the backwardness of Muslim scientists today is not because of Islam, because for the past few hundred years, Muslims have not been ruled by Islam. In the first 200 to 300 years of Islam, scientific progression was going ahead at a speed while Muslims were ruled by Islam. So the reason for the lack of scientific progression goes back to economic reasons, as well as military reasons, being military invasions of different countries, as well as regimes, and there are so many considerations to be given. Clerics have never opposed science.
Oh, that's nonsense. With respect, huge respect to you, but that's nonsense.
Which Muslim has opposed science?
Had an amazing 400 years between...
When they were the most religious. When they were the most religious.
Let me finish.
But you're interjecting someone else's question. You had your turn.
Along came some of the Muslim clerics and said...
Name them.
That was...
Name the cleric.
That was not...
Name the cleric.
That was not what was wanted by Allah.
Name the cleric. You can't name one cleric.
Wanted by... Yes, it was a minute. That was not what was wanted by Allah or Muhammad.
Which cleric?
And then it all went downhill.
Which cleric?
In 1600.
Which one?
Quotes an Arabic scientist 500 years earlier.
Who? What's his name? Which?
Since then...
Again, which cleric are you referring to?
I can't remember.
You shouldn't quote things like this. It's very unfair.
Wait. Just because I can't remember...
One cleric cannot have...
No, it was a consensus at the time.
There was no consensus.
Oh, yes, there was. Okay.
You can't just
Jim
make...
Al-Khalili, have you heard of Jim Al-Khalili?
Pardon?
Jim Al-Khalili wrote a book about Arabic.
Al-Khalili.
And just because I don't remember the name of the top of my head...
Can anyone help him?
I'm trying.
Go on, anyone give... He's doing an internet search. But I think he means to say, I'll help you. I'll help you. I think you're trying to refer... I think you're referring to the debate between Ibn Rushd and Ghazali. Is that what you're referring to? Everyone's doing internet searches. Okay, any other questions?
Shaykh, just over here. Thank you. My question is...
Is there anyone in the back? Because this brother interjected. You kind of already had a question. Remember? But I'll give him a second chance. Go on. I want to be as fair as possible.
It's going to be a very short question. Exclusively, why do you think your religion is the correct one?
Thank you very much. Basically, when anyone investigates any religion, they have the right to investigate all of the religions in order to make their choice. So I would say to you, if you wanted to investigate Islam and compare it to other religions, I would have to rationally answer all objections posed from all the other religions for you to make that choice to accept Islam. So our exclusivity is not as black and white as people may imagine. Because I mentioned to you, for instance, in terms of salvation, because ultimately this question of accepting a religion goes back to the question of salvation. In terms of salvation, someone ostensibly may not be a Muslim but still have salvation. How? The message of Islam doesn't reach them, or they have a mental inability to comprehend religion, or a child who dies young. All these factors are taken into consideration. Our job is only to present Islam rationally to people. After that, there is no compulsion for you to accept or not to accept.
Okay.
You only said you only have one question. There's one at the back as well.
Sheikh, my question is more to do with something which was mentioned in the last talk and something which you referred to today as well, to do with the methodology.
Speak a bit louder, please.
Is to do with the methodology in the sense that you refer to the two concepts of the Salsul and Dor, circular reasoning and infinite regress. The first question, I've got two questions. The first question is why would these be classed as irrational concepts? And then the second question would be that if the reasoning for them being classed as irrational is the inherent infinity in them, then why can that irrationality not extend to the concept of God or paradise?
Okay, the first question that you ask is why are these considered as irrational? Remember, it's a rational judgment is different to a judgment based on observation. Observation is something that we see, and a rational judgment is something which the mind will tell us. So if someone told you 2 + 2 is 5, would that be an irrational judgment? The answer is yes. Would you be able to explain that to someone? The answer is in some cases, some things are self-evident and other things are take reasoning, and if someone cannot understand that reasoning, then they may fall into error. So in this case, if I say a regression of contingent things is impossible, that is based on the fact that those individual contingent things or a whole contingent thing is not self-existent, meaning observably it is not self-existent. So a continuation of those things would be impossible. With regard to the second question, which is paradise and God, there's a distinction between the two. Paradise is a creation that's maintained. There's a difference. I mean, paradise is contingent. If God wanted to, He could instantiate a paradise, and if He wanted to, He can take out of existence paradise. So when we say paradise exists forever, it would mean paradise came into existence, so therefore it is contingent, and maintained at every single given point by God Almighty. But the cause of paradise goes back to a self-sustaining cause. So the self-sustaining cause goes back to the initial conversation that me and Guy had regarding a self-sustaining cause being the only conclusion that we can make from observing the contingent universe around us. It goes back to what I said to you, meaning that we go back to the first irrational processing, which is a continuation of contingent things, which cannot happen. Meaning you can't continue forever. It must stop at one point, which is a self-sustaining cause. No, because why it would not lead back to blind faith is because this is not the only argument for a God. No, they don't, because we would have to sit down and evaluate every single argument. We haven't evaluated the argument from providence. We haven't evaluated the argument from teleological aspects. We haven't evaluated different arguments, even scrutinizing the Quran and the contents of the Quran. And I think time has finished as well. Again, if you notice, for most part of the lecture, I have not quoted the Quran. And the only reason I may have quoted parts of the Quran is to prove a point that the Quran tells us not to be irrational.